Before we begin our panel discussion, The Real Cost of Mass Surveillance, I want to acknowledge why this conversation feels so urgent right now. Part of the reason folks are looking more closely at surveillance and data sharing these days is that political structures and democratic norms in this country, once we assumed were stable, are now being broken. Institutions that we counted on to set limits, protect rights, and enforce oversight no longer feel reliable in the same way. Which brings us to the question at the center of this event. Who was watching Quincy? And who decided they could? Surveillance today is not limited to what we can easily see. It can include doorbell cameras, phone location data, automated license plate readers, and other systems that collect information about where people go and when. These systems raise important questions about privacy, oversight, accountability, and how local data may be shared beyond city borders. Today we'll focus on two parts of that picture. One, Quincy's use of flock safety automated license plate readers, or ALPRs, the number of which has jumped from 5 to 62 in the past few years. And two, Quincy's relationship to the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, called BRIC, and the Metro Boston Homeland Security Region, or MBHSR. Lots of acronyms. Communities across the Commonwealth have begun examining surveillance systems and intelligence sharing agreements that operate in their own cities and towns. Recently, Brookline, Watertown, Natick, Cambridge, and others have taken a closer look at questions surrounding flock, BRIC, or both. And that matters because it shows that this is not a fringe concern or purely a theoretical debate. Residents and local officials in municipalities like ours are asking practical questions about oversight, data sharing, data retention, and public consent. Quincy should do the same. Our goal today is to better understand what these systems do, how they affect residents, and what steps Quincy officials can take now to halt contracts, increase transparency and public oversight, and reconsider BRIC Fusion Center cooperation. We've got some small housekeeping items here. This is a moderated question and answer format. They'll be followed by a short audience Q&A toward the end. We have some pens and Post-it notes circulating that you can write down your questions. If you don't get a chance to ask our panel, you can post it over by the wall there with the red question mark, and we can chat online after. And also, we are recording and streaming on Zoom right now. So we have our expert panel here that's come to help us navigate some tough questions. So let's get into it. Good afternoon, everyone. Could you each please briefly introduce yourself and your organization and tell us why flock ALPRs and BRIC membership should be on every Quincy resident's radar?
Hi everyone, I'm Fatema Ahmed. I am Executive Director of Muslim Justice League. We're a Greater Boston area organization that does a lot of local community organizing here. We also do some national work because there are just very few Muslim organizations around the country, especially those that can talk about the war on terror. So we've been organizing locally here for about a decade. And for us, thinking about the war on terror, which we are 25 years into it right now, and I'm sure, as you all know, and I hope you all care about the fact that the war is very much aflame now. What is happening in Iran and Palestine in this moment is part of that war that actually goes back 100 years, not just the past 25 years. But what we've seen is in the past 25 years, the war on terror has allowed U.S. government and predominantly police enforcement, law enforcement, police agencies from the federal to local level to greatly expand their power particularly through surveillance infrastructure. And that includes, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center and many other structures that we'll talk about today. And so we've just seen this huge expansion that impacts our communities, like first and foremost. We're always like the tip of the spear. We're always going to feel that impact before other people do. And for us, it's important for other people to understand what that feels like, what that looks like. And so for Quincy to have, one of the largest license plate reader networks in Massachusetts and to participate in BRIC, like our community is impacted by that. We know what that feels like, and it's incredibly important for folks in Quincy to fight back now before it gets much worse.
Hi, my name is Alex Marthews. I am the co-chair of a volunteer civil liberties group called Digital Fourth. For the last 15 years, in mostly Boston and Cambridge and Somerville, and at the State House, we have been fighting back against mass government surveillance. I and my fellow volunteers try to figure out the levers that can be pressed and the strategies that work to dial back on the intrusive surveillance technologies that have become so common and that often get adopted by police departments on their own initiative, working with vendors and without consulting with the general population or even sometimes with the elected officials. So I'm flattered to have been invited to talk to you guys, and I'm here to try and give a sense of the scope of what these technologies mean in Fourth Amendment terms, and to give you some hope on this, that it really can work if people work together to dial back on technologies, and when they do, they generally find that these are not popular. The surveillance state future is not inevitable, and it's something that we really can affect and shape if we work together.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. My name is Gideon Epstein, and I'm a policy counsel with the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. And I'm really grateful to Nina for inviting all three of us for this wonderful panel and such a timely conversation. I'm really hoping to talk about flock license plate readers today. Our team at the ACLU has been working on license plate reader oversight issues for the last 10 to 15 years. And just over the past couple of years, we've done extensive public records requests to request information from police departments across Massachusetts, including here in Quincy, to inquire about what the state of their license plate reader surveillance systems are. And of course, what we found here in Quincy is that there are 60 plus license plate readers across roadways. I think to take a step back, I think it's good just to clarify what license plate readers are. License plate readers are a form of location tracking technology that police use to track suspects, and unfortunately this technology is also abused too much of the time, and furthermore, a lot of the safeguards that are built in, or really that aren't built into the system, enable abuse, where you have police officers making searches within a company like Flock's database where they use completely vague and non-descriptive search reasons. So instead of searching for a suspect of a homicide with a specific case number, you'll often see police officers, and including here in Quincy from the audits that I've reviewed, making searches that just state investigation or state wanted or state info. And with those kinds of searches, there is so much opportunity for abuse. There's opportunity for abuse that would apply no matter the times that we're in. And what I mean by that is that you unfortunately have police officers in other parts of the country especially. I don't think we have any evidence that this has occurred here in Quincy, but in other parts of the country, there have been over a dozen cases where police officers have, for example, tracked their current or ex-romantic partner. And there's been reporting recently from the Institute for Justice, which is a right-leaning think tank, that's basically recorded 18 times where police officers in other jurisdictions have made these kinds of searches to track down their current or ex-romantic partner. It's disgusting kind of behavior that is unacceptable from police officers. We also have concerns that are heightened because of the times that we're in right now. Just to give a couple of examples, many of us have heard about a police officer in Johnson County who used flock system to search for a woman who they believed had a self-administered abortion. And even though that woman happened to be within the confines of the state of Texas at that time, had they been outside of Texas, their location information would have been picked up, had they been here in Massachusetts or had they been in another jurisdiction, because flock enables this kind of widespread data sharing. I want to give it back to these great questions, but just another brief example, and I'm sure we'll expand on it more. The kind of data sharing that flock enables also puts immigrants at risk, and that's one of the main reasons that we've gotten involved in this advocacy, both on the local and state level.
So I'm glad you mentioned specifically the license plate readers. Could you briefly describe how it works and how can somebody on the street identify one?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So as I mentioned, it's location tracking technology. We'll sometimes hear from a representative from Flock or another license plate reader vendor that all their technology does is write down license plate numbers, and that would be a huge oversimplification. They'll argue that if cameras are just writing down license plate numbers, that's something that police officers themselves would be able to do on roadways, which of course is true, but again, it's a huge oversimplification because the reality is this technology is used for location tracking, and location tracking is what, is really what makes our Fourth Amendment rights and our state constitutional rights come into play. We already have constitutional protections around the Fourth Amendment that protect against warrantless location tracking through other technologies, for example, through cell site location tracking. The Supreme Court has recognized in the Carpenter case that for police to track someone for 7 days or more to view their historical location information, they need to get a warrant. And the reality is those kinds of protections have not caught up to license plate reader surveillance. But with that said, there has been some movement here in Massachusetts. Our Supreme Judicial Court has recognized that with enough cameras and enough locations, this kind of license plate reader surveillance may trigger state constitutional protections under the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, Article 12, which is the analog to the Fourth Amendment in our U.S. Constitution. And just to address, what do these cameras look like? I guess that's something I also didn't say. How does this location tracking work? There are cameras placed throughout roadways all over Massachusetts and all over the country. There are about 80 police departments here in the state of Massachusetts that contract with Flock. There are also other problematic license plate reader vendors, and I wouldn't want anyone leaving with the impression that Flock is the only company that's problematic in this space. But these cameras, they generally have a solar panel affixed to them. And I would just say, if you're interested in finding out where they are, there is a Deflock Me map that you all can check out. So that should be a way to identify some of the locations. But anyway, you all can look up what does a Flock license plate reader camera look like, and you can get a very clear idea.
So, as mentioned in the introduction, a growing number of municipalities are canceling these contracts with Flock and choosing not to go through with the contract after a trial. What's driving that trend? Sure.
Just wanted to add about finding the Flock cameras. There are so many cameras out there. So, I think when you start looking for them, you are going to realize how surveilled you are, because you're going to be like, is that a Flock license plate reader, or is that some other camera? They're smaller than you would expect. The solar panel is one of the easy ways to identify them, because usually they need a power source. And one thing that we could potentially do if folks are interested, and we did this in across Cambridge and Boston, when Cambridge and Boston both briefly had flock license plate readers, is a bike ride to ride around the city and like look for them and actually put them into the deflock map. So the deflock map is something you can participate in. When you find them, you can put them in, whether it's flock or some other type of license plate reader. I actually don't know how to ride a bike, but have organized 2 of these bike rides, and it's a really fun way to find them. And also want to highlight like the fact that Quincy has so many. So Boston briefly had about 45 flock license plate readers and has paused them. And so for Quincy to have so many is really surprising.
So I want to talk a little bit about the fight in Cambridge that we've just had, because that showcases a lot of this kind of work and what can be done. In Cambridge in 2024, the City Council approved the deployment of flock cameras. At the time, the chair of the Public Safety Committee was a person who was strongly pro-police and who waved through any requests for the deployment of any surveillance technology with really very little consideration or review. His general perspective was that if something was free or even cheap to the city, then efficacy did not need to be considered and civil liberties concerns did not need to be considered. Then he ran into some political trouble, and at the same time, over the course of May through to September of 2025, there were a lot of stories that were starting to come out, like the story that you alluded to about the lady who was seeking a termination. But not only that, importantly, there were stories coming through from multiple jurisdictions, not just that flock was bad and intrusive, which it is, but also that flock safety itself as a vendor had systematically deceived municipalities. So, for example, they had been going round to hundreds of municipalities, and when they were asked, so tell us about data sharing with federal agencies, can you tell us that you do not share data that could be used by ICE? Then they were saying, yeah, we don't have any agreements with ICE, we don't have any agreements with any federal agency. Your data is yours, it's safe with you, just do not worry about that. Then it turned out in August, I think, that they in fact had been running a secret pilot program that in fact was systematically sharing flock data with federal agencies, including CBP, and then it later emerged that yes, ICE was one of those agencies, and they just had not been telling municipalities this. There were instances, I think that one was in Evanston in Illinois, where city councils had started to get antsy and had asked for flock cameras to physically come down, and flock safety had said no. And said, there was a contract to put them up. We're not going to expend the effort to take them down. And so now there are municipalities that cover them with trash bags. There are, in fact, cases where city councils have asked for the flock operation to stop in those cities, and flock safety has said to them, okay, we'll stop for your purposes, but they continue collecting the data and continue sharing it with other municipalities. So the way that flock safety was construing stop this was not stop collecting data on our residents, but stop the ability of your police department to have access to the data that is being collected. So there was a great deal of shiftiness going on, and we were able to highlight in detail those stories and that shiftiness. As the full war wore on, the resignation of that city councillor from his position as public safety chair created some more flexibility on the public safety committee, and they agreed to have a hearing that in the end recommended a suspension of flock safety. And we were organising volunteers and individuals to come and testify at all of these meetings. One of the key questions was, where are the cameras, right? And police departments are often reluctant to disclose the exact locations of the cameras. What we realised was, at some level the city must know where these are going up, because there must be bodies that give permission for the physical installation of those cameras. And so in the case of Cambridge, there is an extremely obscure city commission called the Pole and Conduit Commission. And we got their agendas and monitored their agendas, and hey presto, there had been an item that said, okay, we are going to put up flock cameras at these 15 different locations. And so asking that minor commission to sign off on it, as they might do the installation of conduit or of a 5G mast or the number of other things that they govern. So from that, we were able to determine the exact locations and intersections of the cameras. And that enabled a very important level of analysis. Gideon referred to the fact that the Supreme Judicial Court has had a ruling on automated license plate readers. It's a ruling called Commonwealth v. McCarthy, and you can look it up. And it's a long ruling, but the practical upshot of that ruling was that the particular ALPR deployment that they were talking about, it was not about flock. That particular ALPR deployment was okay, but they said some ALPR deployments do violate the Fourth Amendment if they too densely and intimately track people's patterns of life and residents' patterns of life. So it might be, hypothetically, that at the time that Quincy first deployed these cameras, when they were starting with 5 cameras, and that's presumably like major highways, sort of entrances and exits to the city, then it wouldn't be possible from that to easily track residents' patterns of everyday life within the city. Now that you've got 62 cameras, if I were a lawyer working for the city, I would be getting extremely nervous about whether that deployment was too dense a deployment under the terms of Commonwealth v. McCarthy, and therefore whether the individual capturing of license plates constitutes a search under the Fourth Amendment. There is also a certain level of deceitfulness about flock in that they do say it's only about license plate tracking, but then it has been disclosed through the kind of data requests that ACLU has been doing. There are flock cameras that are trained on playgrounds where there are no roads. If that is the case, how can it be just about license plates? Because there are no license plates. We are fortunate in Cambridge that we previously helped to pass a ban on local law enforcement use of facial recognition. So we knew that in our instance of a flock deployment, facial recognition was not an issue. And there were no flock cameras being deployed at playgrounds in Cambridge. But in other cities, they have not already done that, and that is a problem. Because that means that you can couple this with facial recognition. Then we went so these hearings were happening last fall. City Council the Public Safety Committee and then City Council decided, well, we're not going to order all the cameras taken down, but there's clearly enough to worry about that we're going to suspend the deployment. And then we'll have another hearing in December to decide whether to finally take them down. And so this was progress. And then, here's the really interesting thing. During that time, in between suspension and the December meeting, a flock technician acting on what must have been some sort of unexpired work order decided on their own initiative from flock to go into the city of Cambridge and put 2 more cameras up. And they only disclosed this, apparently, to the city manager and to Cambridge PD on the morning of the December hearing where there was going to be a decision as to revocation. And at that point, basically, the city manager threw up his hands and said, they're in material breach here, and who are these clowns? So all of that, let's say, was helpful. But the key to this, as you can see, was mobilizing, being highly aware of what meetings and leverage points there were, being highly aware of what reporting there was around flock, having the help of ACLU, having the help of the Democratic Socialists of America, who were terrific, and mobilized a bunch of people, and making sure that city councillors understood the kind of thing I was saying to you, that privacy is not dead. This mere room is evidence of that. People really do care about their privacy, and if they're given the opportunity to demonstrate that care for one another, and that distaste at being tracked at their every movement and their every action, then they can express that and they can get that implemented. And at that point, the political pressure was too great. City Council decided to revoke the flock contract and to take all the cameras down, and as far as I know, they're all down.
Thank you for summarizing the insider's view of what happened in Cambridge recently. It's really important. Fatema, I wanted to ask what the relationship is between Quincy and Brick and why our community should care.
Okay, so big question is, what is Brick? How many people here, Jilly, you can't be part of this, how many people here know what Brick is? Okay, great. That's exciting, and it makes sense because a lot more people in the area are realizing that their cities participate in Brick and that it's not just a Boston problem. So I'm going to break down what Brick is here in a moment. When you think about surveillance, how many of you feel like every week you're hearing about some new technology that has all of your information and you're like, oh my God, what do I do about it? Okay, yeah. So for us, we have been, organizing against surveillance and policing for a decade now, and have had a lot of success. Even just last year, we stopped the Boston Police Department and Brick from using 3 new social media surveillance tools that they secretly started using before asking permission. Year after year, we've had a number of wins, and part of this is because we think about the bigger picture of how all of this comes together. So what we've seen is once in a while, a particular technology will get a lot of attention. Right now, it's flock license plate readers. But really, you have to actually think about the police themselves. They are surveilling you with or without technology. I live in Dorchester, that's why I'm late. Dorchester Parade made it impossible to get here. In a black and brown neighborhood where, you know, the cops just sit in unmarked cars watching people, right? They will always do that. And when they have technology, that like amplifies their access to information, right? So you can think about each piece of technology as like this portal into a bunch of information that they might not normally have. And then you have police working together, and that amplifies their access to each other and every portal that each officer has. So in terms of like power, when police work together and talk to each other, that is the biggest problem that you have, actually, because like each of them is coming with their logins to their data, and they're gonna say, well, that other guy he can't log into this directly, so you shouldn't worry about it. But if they're sitting beside each other, do you think they don't ask, hey, can you look this up, right? That's actually what happened. My dear friends are the ones who exposed that with Flock. Flock was saying, we don't have a contract with ICE. They were saying, we're better than Motorola license plate readers, which Massachusetts State Police have Motorola. Motorola has been like, we proudly work with ICE. We'll give them whatever they want. Flock was saying, we don't work with ICE, but you could have local police departments talk to someone at ICE and say, oh, I'll run this search for you, right? That's part of what was exposed, like one of these big headlines about, you know, Flock's information getting out to ICE. And so that element of them talking to each other happens through task forces and through fusion centers. Fusion centers are a big one that a lot of people don't know about, created by the War on Terror. There's one in at least one in every state, but here in Massachusetts, we're special. We have a regional one called the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, or BRIC, B-R-I-C. It happens to be one of the largest in the country. So there's about 50 people sitting in the Boston Police Department who are part of this regional surveillance network. There's a DHS agent there and an FBI agent there. There's also police officers in it who are also part of FBI task forces or other like federal collaborations. They all have their own access to different pieces of information that they're bringing together. And Quincy is one of the cities, the 9 cities that participates in BRIC. Not only that, but your license plate reader network is through BRIC. So BRIC gets annual funding from the Department of Homeland Security to do its work. Essentially, like these fusion centers, including BRIC, were established by DHS. And while they're technically run by the local police department, they are required to like meet DHS standards, and that happens through this annual funding. The funding says, here's our national priority areas, like right now it's border enforcement and election security, aka all about immigrants, right? So that grant says, you know, you have to actually meet these requirements, including spending a certain amount on policing and surveillance. So this is like a combination of DHS's agenda happening here at the local level, but also, to be clear, whether or not this was through DHS, your local police departments all want to talk to each other. Like they love having this spy center where they have a regional camera network, it's over 1,000 cameras, regional shot spotter network, which is like the audio detection. Cambridge actually just ended its shot spotter contract, which was through like this BRIC funding. And the newest thing is establishing a regional license plate reader network that was supposed to start in this year of 2026. So that's part of why you see Quincy, Boston, and I think Revere and Winthrop and maybe one other brick city were going to be part of, starting up this license plate reader network. Boston got Flock temporarily and has paused it. They had a different brand of license plate readers in the past, and we expect that they'll probably try some other, brand in the near future. But yeah, through BRIC, they are establishing these regional surveillance networks so that they can work together. And so you also have a question of like, well, if, this city allows this thing and not this other thing, but the other city has like the opposite laws, you can get around that by working together, right? And having access to each other's, surveillance equipment and platforms. Then the bigger problem is just like BRIC itself. Like, if there's anything you get from this, please don't just fight Flock and then think that like that has made, the difference for immigrants and Muslims and Black folks who are like heavily impacted by policing and surveillance. Because Quincy's participation in BRIC and Quincy's general practices around ICE are really bad on their own. BRIC has access to lots of databases, not just like the Flock license plate reader network, but again, regional camera network, regional ShotSpotter. There's dozens of databases that BRIC participates in that federal law enforcement access quite regularly. BRIC has a gang database that has been like a huge fight locally, where they can just claim that people are gang members, and we've had a number of community members deported, lives actually ruined because of claims of being on the gang database. BRIC surveils my organization. Hi, BRIC, you're probably watching this, which is fine. They look at MJL's social media, check our Instagram stories, and they'll send off emails about like, oh, they have this kind of event. God forbid, because Muslim Justice League is an organization that talks about Palestine, so we're really scary. So when the genocide in Gaza started, from about October of 2023 to April of 2024, just like 6-7 months, we have 600 pages of reports that BRIC was putting out twice a day about all Palestine-related events in the area. That includes the Boston Palestine Film Festival, vigils for ceasefire, like student events, everything under the sun, including like First Amendment protected activities. Basically all of these things are First Amendment protected activities. They did that during Occupy Boston too. There's like 1,500 pages on Occupy. So BRIC is the source of like the majority of policing and surveillance issues in the Boston area, all brought together in this one place. So it's really important as you all in Quincy think about this, and we're, as MJL, like we really want to organize with folks here. We have members who live in Quincy or who grew up here. You could take on Flock license plate readers as a step towards pulling out of BRIC, or the other way around. But you have to be thinking about this like bigger picture, because sometimes we'll see people just take up the hot issue in that moment and be like, oh, well, we passed a transparency law about this thing, and so we've really helped immigrants. Nope. Like, you have to be in it for the long run and be thinking about, what does policing and surveillance look like in Quincy overall? Who's been fighting it before us? Like, what can we build off of? Not just in Quincy, but the whole area. Brookline is now the first city considering pulling out of BRIC. Town, not city, sorry. Which is really huge. Quincy could be one of the next ones, hopefully.
So you've already touched on this a bit, about how the LPRs and teaching centers disproportionately affect our communities of color and immigrants and other marginalized groups. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, yeah. Generally, when we think about, policing and surveillance in this country, it's Black folks, immigrants, and Muslims who are at the forefront of being impacted by it. And as someone who's on the left, I will say, like, folks on the left also get targeted by this across the board. That happens, but it's usually like it looks a little bit different, right? Like if you are actively organizing, you might be targeted, but Black and brown people just overall are targeted regardless of what they're doing, and like heavily impacted by it day to day. So one, thing that I would warn against is the common thing that we see where leftists are like, oh, like, I just got visited by the FBI. I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe I would be treated like this. For Muslims in the Boston area, we did a survey, and 10% of Muslims in this progressive area have been personally or their family been visited by the FBI at home. Like, that is so common in our community that, like, we all know how to deal with it. It's like one of our main Know Your Rights workshops. Other people do not deal with that regularly. If 10% of other people were impacted by that, no one would shut up about it. But because it happens to us, like, no one cares until it happens to them. And then suddenly it's like, oh my God, how could this happen to us, right? So the gang database that Brick runs is a good example of that. The vast majority of people in the gang database are Black and brown people. And I think it's like 75% are just Black men and boys. I have young Black and brown men come to me all the time who say, how do these cops know my name? Like, I was just walking home from school and this cop stopped me and he knows everything about me. Am I on some kind of database? There used to be like 4,000 or 5,000 people on the gang database. Now it's smaller because of our organizing. They've actually been deleting people off of it because they're scared. I want to be clear that, like, certain communities are always going to be bearing the brunt of this, and it's going to be on you all to actually, like, organize with those folks, right? Like, MJL can be one of those organizations, but we have to make sure as you're organizing in Quincy that you're actually supporting the folks who are, impacted by it. Because sometimes when advocacy is led by predominantly like white organizations, it might miss the mark by a long shot. So people might say, well, it can, you can use this kind of thing as long as, or you can't use it unless it's like certain circumstances like terrorism or gang members. Like, often people are left out or carved out, left behind in terms of policy making. And again, like, who do we think is a terrorist? Nowadays, everybody's a terrorist. So, like, welcome to the club. Like, nowadays, everyone kind of gets that, right? But previously, it's been our communities. And so in terms of, like, what we've seen from Brick in particular, like, they have surveilled Muslims for using the word ummah, which just means the Muslim community. Like, they had social media surveillance set up to just look for really basic Muslim terms. The other term that they were looking for was like hashtag Black Lives Matter. So folks like talking about BLM, but the majority of terms that they were looking at were just like Muslim or Arabic terms. We see that in whose protests are getting surveilled, right? The fact that, like, these Palestine protests are so heavily surveilled when there's lots of other events happening all of the time. Or just the other day, we spoke to Boston City Council about the types of events that Brick highlights. Like, they look at they'll put out these reports saying, well, Al-Qaeda is saying this, ISIS is saying this, there was a knife attack in Paris done by a Muslim, and so we have to look at these Palestine protests. And like I told, the Boston City councilors, They sure aren't putting out reports every time there's a, bar fight in Southie, right? Like, the way that they think about violence is racist. We know that. That's just like built into policing and surveillance in general. And so what you're seeing in this moment is there's now this federal agenda, right, to go after immigrants any way that they can. And the fact that BRIC is getting this funding that actually says they have to participate in border enforcement and election security just makes it obvious. The strings were always attached with that money. It's just now getting a lot worse. We know the strings were always attached because Quincy, Boston, all of the BRIC cities said, we're still gonna apply for this grant despite this border enforcement requirement because BRIC meets the requirement. So they are just confirming what we have always said. Like, information is getting to ICE quite regularly through them talking to each other and sharing access to this kind of information that they have, whether it's the gang database, flock license plate readers, etc. That information is getting out there. It's much more overt, and there's a lot more funding going towards DHS and ICE to do that. But I also urge you, as you're thinking about protecting immigrants in particular, to understand Black people are impacted by this, whether they are immigrants or not. Muslims are impacted by this, whether they are immigrants or not. There's so many communities that are deeply impacted by this, and organizing with them and understanding, what they're dealing with day to day is really important.
Thank you so much. Yes.
That was a great summary of the issues that come about relating to this. I just want to add very briefly, there is a phrase that police departments use for a lot of this surveillance, or whether it's of First Amendment protected organizations or of the ordinary activities of people of color. And they use the phrase FISA, or for your situational awareness. And they circulate bulletins to notify police departments and universities and others of there is this thing going on and it is of concern. I have never seen a bulletin circulate saying there is a game going on between the Celtics and the Dolphins. And you need to be aware of that for situational purposes. On the other hand, I was listening in to a call of the Metropolitan Boston Homeland Security Region, which is law enforcement, and they were talking about the upcoming World Cup, and one law enforcement officer weighed in on that call and said, yeah, we're very concerned about the Haiti match that is coming up. Oh, really? And why are you particularly concerned about the Haiti match among all of the other matches that are going on? What makes the perception be there that it's going to be the Haitians who are going to make trouble?
I have a Fourth Amendment question, Alex. Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, requiring specific warrants. How does that protection translate to the digital world that we're in right now, and where does it fall short?
How many hours do you have? No, it is a complicated question, but I'll try and put it this way. The way I usually talk about it is this. Searches and seizures used to be expensive, and they used to be hard. It used to involve a physical cop going to a physical property, and you had to pay that cop to do it. In the digital world, the collection of data is cheap. The storage of data is cheap. The sharing of data is cheap, and getting cheaper all the time. That has created a bonanza of information, not only that we create and share, but that also goes to law enforcement. 30 years ago, conversations you had with a neighbor might be at a backyard barbecue or across a back fence, and many of those conversations are now digitally mediated in ways that are accessible to law enforcement and the intelligence services. And they view themselves as having a right to that material in a way that they wouldn't necessarily feel that they had a right to just what you were saying in a conversation over a back fence. So it's become much easier, and the scope of it has become infinitely larger. The way that this translates to application to specific technologies can be awkward. There is a famous, in my world, discussion on the Supreme Court in a case called US v. Jones. They were trying to work out if you attached a GPS tracker to the car of a girlfriend of a suspected drug dealer, and you track those movements, of the car, was that a search? Did it require a warrant? And one Justice Scalia said, you know, we need to think about what the founders would have thought about this. And how intrusive would they have found it? And Justice Alito said, look, no, that's ridiculous. You can't just think about it in that way, because at that time what you would have needed in somebody's carriage was a very tiny constable. And also one that did not sleep or rest or need to go to the bathroom. And so I'm not sure how applicable it is there. But that is in effect what we've got. We have 1 million tiny unsleeping constables in the form of digital sensors as we go about our everyday lives. And we have to navigate as a society now, given that we've got that, what right do police have to intercept that information and make use of it for their situational awareness? Or potentially to our detriment, or potentially if it's an ex that they're interested in, or potentially if it is a serious crime that is being committed. These are serious questions, and society and the courts are wrestling with them, and the Commonwealth v. McCarthy decision is one of the instances where they try to figure out where the line should lie. The point here is for me to say this is difficult. People are thinking about it, they're trying to navigate it, and all of you have a role to play in where you want that line to lie for Quincy and for the broader Boston area. You have voices and you have views, and those views are legitimate, and it should not just be up to law enforcement to do exactly what they feel is right in the moment, because the natural tendency of law enforcement is to adopt any tool that they feel might even potentially be useful towards the solution of crime.
And at what point do these ALPRs specifically become a tracking system?
Opinions differ. So from my perspective and the perspective of Digital Fourth more broadly, we do not believe that there has yet been an ALPR system designed that is appropriate or non-privacy intrusive. But we are aware that the state of New Hampshire has better rules than other states. And what they have said basically is that there is a general prohibition on ALPR. There is a specific exception at the toll gates on the freeways, but that when you are collecting that ALPR information, an officer has to flag a plate. A human officer has to flag that match with a plate on a hot list within 3 minutes. And otherwise, if that is not flagged, then that data gets deleted, and otherwise it's just used for tolling purposes. So we are not saying that this or other technologies have no possible uses, because clearly they do. But there are communities and states that have navigated this in ways that seem to be okay. And nobody is looking at New Hampshire and going, oh my God, what a crime-infested hellhole. It is practically the war of all against all, red in tooth and claw up there. Nobody could tolerate to live in this place because they do have such strict rules around ALPR. That's not happening.
Municipalities insist that they own the data that these cameras collect, but FLOC's updated terms and conditions appear to have changed that. And any of you can comment on this. What right does FLOC now claim over the data, and what rights are left for the municipalities?
ACLU did a great article on this, so Gideon, you want to take this?
Sure, I'm happy to. So it's a great question, and I think with respect to the contract and other decisions that FLOC has made, what we found is that FLOC is reactive to the concerns of residents. They don't proactively prevent data sharing that puts immigrants at risk, that puts abortion seekers at risk. They instead try to find these super specific loopholes, like saying we don't contract with ICE, but they do in fact contract with hundreds of police departments that share data with ICE that are officially deputized to enforce civil immigration laws. So I think that's a through line. But on the contract specifically, what we found with respect to a number of Massachusetts Police Department's contracts with FLOC is that FLOC itself retains ownership of the data and not the local police departments. This is one area where FLOC continues to update its contract language on basically a unilateral basis. What they do is post their terms and conditions to their website, so any of you can go look up FLOC's terms and conditions today. They have changed a lot since we first raised concerns about this. But as of 6 months ago and a year ago, FLOC's standard contract language stated, we own the data and we hold a worldwide perpetual license to share this data when there are emergency conditions, when there are quote unquote, good faith security issues that they need to respond to. And that's a significant problem because it's municipalities and police departments that should maintain control over this very sensitive license plate reader data that reflects the movements of Massachusetts residents and others on our roadways. So in other words, I think it's worthwhile for police departments to take a close look at their current contract language and make sure that it's them and not a vendor like FLOC that controls their license plate reader data.
Beyond that, it's important to observe that you can put whatever language in a local contract you like about who has titular ownership of the data, but FLOC, by the nature of its system, is going to still have access to that data, even if Quincy PD is the titular owner. They're going to have access to it for a period of time, and any other law enforcement department has the ability to search FLOC cameras in Quincy and to find the movements of people in Quincy by virtue of those searches. You can hypothesize maybe that FLOC could create an end-to-end encrypted system where FLOC cannot see the data and no other law enforcement department could see the data unless they had a warrant tied to a particular crime, but that's nothing like the system that they've got or ever will have. FLOC, for the value of its system, depends on network effects. Their proposition is, hey, you PD, sign up to this and you will gain access to 90,000 cameras across the country from tons and tons of police departments. And that's going to be super useful for you. And with every marginal police department that gets added to the network, the value of what they're offering to the next police department grows. It's a network effect. And so it is absolutely anathema to their business model to offer proper, localized, encrypted data security that would give local communities actual control. So, do not be diverted into trying to negotiate for a provision that says, oh, Quincy PD owns the data. Ultimately, because of the nature of the FLOC safety system, that's not going to make things okay.
All right, thank you for that. I want to shift a little bit, to focus more on privacy. I've heard out there that some residents say that they have no expectation of privacy from ALPRs because their license plates are visible to the public. How would you respond to that claim?
I think Gideon can take this, but again, I think we're all pointing to the fact that, like, humans being able to see your license plate once in a while is so vastly different from the kind of technologies we're seeing now, where I would say we shouldn't even call it an automated license plate reader network, but we should talk about it as like tracking your vehicle, right? Like Flock is not actually just reading license plates, but it's creating a fingerprint for your car. So if you have even like a nondescript like black SUV, like lots of people have, it is looking at like the dents, the coloring, like all the unique factors of your car to be able to say, well, between this license plate and everything else that we can see, this is who this is attached to, right? Because obviously people can swap out license plates, right, for a particular car. And Flock is also looking to like expand to just straight up tracking people and pulling in everything else about you.
Thanks, Fatema. I certainly agree with the point about how this technology should be named and the fact that when we call it a license plate reader, it ignores that this is location tracking technology, which we believe does implicate Fourth Amendment protections, does implicate state constitutional protections that I spoke about earlier. But I guess just to take a step back on this question about what is our reasonable expectation of privacy in relation to license plate readers, it's US v. Katz. That is one of the sentinel cases around privacy law. Basically, the Supreme Court said in that case, where a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy, their Fourth Amendment rights may be implicated. The person has to both have a subjective expectation of privacy that's reasonable, and in addition, a person's reasonable expectation of privacy has to be one that society objectively recognizes. So it's both a subjective and an objective reasonable expectation of privacy test, which might sound confusing, but that is what it is. And I also mentioned the Carpenter case. This case is really important. About 5 years ago, the Supreme Court said that we do retain a reasonable expectation of privacy even in our movements in public places. And that's what's directly related to license plate reader technology. Of course, many folks who work for Flock or folks in the law enforcement community who are proponents of this kind of technology and don't see the Fourth Amendment issues, they argue that when we go drive our vehicles out in public, we lose our reasonable expectation of privacy by going out on public roadways. And we see the Carpenter case and what the Supreme Court has said there and what the Supreme Judicial Court has said in the Commonwealth v. McCarthy case. And it's pretty clear that you actually don't leave your reasonable expectation of privacy behind when you drive on public roadways or you go out in public, whether you're walking or driving. So as is the case for many kinds of technologies, right now, law enforcement use of surveillance technology is outpacing the law. And I think one other important point that's important in this conversation is that it's not just up to court, it's not only up to courts to guarantee our constitutional rights. It's also up to law enforcement leaders, it's up to local elected leaders to not wait until a possible constitutional violation has been proven. We should take steps in our communities right now, that start at the community level where folks speak up and they say, I'm actually not comfortable with this kind of location tracking technology in my community, and that's why 5 communities so far within this state have cut ties with Flock, and countless others across the country have done the same. Also just going back to Fatema's point earlier that Flock is not the only culprit in this space, and it's not the only kind of surveillance technology that we should be concerned with. So we need to go well beyond raising concerns about license plate reader technology.
Great, thanks. It leads us really nicely into this last question, which is, Alex and Fatema, what would you say to city leaders who insist that Quincy needs block ALPRs and brick membership to keep the residents safe?
I think the first thing that I would say is, and that we say to police departments and to city leaders in the different cities that we work in, is that we are blessed here in Greater Boston. We are blessed to live in communities that not only have low crime, but have probably a third of the crime that they had 30 years ago. This is a wonderful situation that we are in, for which police departments should take their part of the credit. But we are not in a situation where we are teetering on the brink of civic anarchy and where we need to have mass surveillance to squeeze those last few crimes out of the system. We're okay. And fundamentally, the other people who live in our communities are mostly okay and mostly can be trusted not to be surveilled by default as they go about their daily lives. As far as I'm concerned, the concern of police departments should be with crime, with actual crimes for which they have probable cause to get involved with somebody's life, to search their person, to search their property, to search their effects, and to track where they go. If they don't have that probable cause, what business is it of theirs? What business is it of theirs to go and be present at a Black Lives Matter protest? They were at the last one that I was at in Roxbury, just in case, because this is the category of things that for situational